Hi, I'm Mikki Morrissette. I'm the publisher and editor of Minnesota Women's Press. We are doing a series on transforming justice. And today we're talking with Nicole Archbold, who is the Director of Community Affairs for the Minnesota Department of Public Safety. She was appointed in March 2019, so she's had a little chance to get her feet planted before this year happened. After John Harrington was appointed by Governor Walz as the Department of Public Safety Commissioner, one of the first things he did was establish a new position on his leadership team to be a bridge between the department and the community. And he recruited Nicole to serve that role. During the first half of your career, Nicole, I know you worked with the Minneapolis Police Department as an evidence technician and a policy analyst that worked on police policy and procedure. You were also at the same time earning a Bachelor of Science degree in law enforcement and a master's degree in public safety administration.
Yeah.
You also worked, I know, for former Minneapolis Mayor Betsy Hodges as policy advisor for public safety with a portfolio that included police, fire, violence prevention, and civil rights issues. So, hi, welcome.
Thank you. Hi.
All right, well, we have a lot of different things to talk about today. Part of the goal of this Transforming Justice is both to set up the conversation about what our government, what our communities, what our cities do on behalf of public safety, what can be tweaked, what programs are running behind the scenes that maybe people don't know as much about, where have we had successes around the state. So we're going to cover a lot of different things today, but let's start with a real basic thing, because I don't think a lot of people know really what the Department of Public Safety does. So can you just explain the scope of the department that you work in?
Sure, certainly. So the Department of Public Safety is a part of the executive branch under the governor. So Governor Tim Walz, as you mentioned, appointed my boss, who is Commissioner Harrington, to be Commissioner of Public Safety. The Department of Public Safety has 10 public-facing divisions and a few other support divisions like human resources and affirmative action, finance. But the public-facing divisions do touch just about every Minnesotan's life. We have the Driver and Vehicle Services Division, so drivers' licenses, ID cards, vehicle registration, the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, which has been very much in the news lately, and they investigate officer-involved deaths, and they also do a lot more than that. They also investigate a lot of criminal activity across the state of Minnesota and support local police departments in doing that. And we have the State Patrol, we have the Fire Marshal. So there's a lot of things going on at the Office of Department of Public Safety.
Okay. So you have degrees in law enforcement and in public safety administration. What drew you to this kind of work?
Well, as far back as I can remember, I used to watch TV shows with my mom that were about, forensics and criminal investigations and true crime. So I really, I grew up watching those shows, and that was just always interesting. My first jobs in the city were adjacent to the police department, so I got to peek a little bit behind the curtain and get to know some of the officers. And when there was an opening at the department, at the police department in the evidence room, I became an evidence tech over there. I went from it was the police garage at the time. So I was more or less an inventory clerk at the police garage, and I'd keep track of all the squad car parts and the auto repairs that happened. But then I transferred over to the police department as an inventory clerk, evidence clerk in the evidence room. And then from there, I decided to continue my college, and that's where I earned my 4-year degree in law enforcement. But the universe had different plans for me besides doing forensics or being a police officer. And so then an opportunity opened up once I had that bachelor's degree to work in the policy area of the police department. From there, I decided to get my master's degree, and when people ask me what is it that you want to do, I didn't know what to say because I really didn't know what I wanted to do other than sit in a room next to decision makers. You know, the media has interesting impacts on public safety, I think, and in different ways. So yeah, it does create false expectations or false impressions of what's possible to be done to solve some of the crimes that happen. Nothing usually gets solved in an hour or less. Typically, you know, magic fingerprints don't appear magically. There's a lot of very tedious, time-consuming work that goes into every single fingerprint match that happens. That's something that I learned. But also the media, you know, I think they both reinforce the negative aspects of the police community dynamics and policing in general, but also it tells the truth about some policing. So it's just a really interesting mix, and I think media in general is very influential around the way that we see public safety.
One of our jobs here is just to help people see the myths and the realities, basically, of what law enforcement is all about. So I want to ask, you know, I know one of the programs you led at the Minneapolis Police Department was the Community Navigator Program, and I'm wondering if you could just explain what that does.
So my last role that I held in the police department, which was actually the year following my term with Mayor Hodges, in the police department, my role there was to stand up this new vision of Chief Arredondo, which was the Community Navigator Program. And the goal is that we would bring in community folks to be able to help bridge the gaps that happen on so many calls where officers, there's nothing legally for the officers to do. There's not an arrest to be made, and there might not be any other resolution really from people calling the police. So, but there's still livability issues that remain. There's still communication challenges and problems with stakeholders around issues, and our officers that are also 911 responders aren't necessarily the best people to try to solve those longer term issues. And so going back to the navigators, one of the examples that Chief Arredondo would talk about is an overdose call where a mother had overdosed and she had small children at home, and the responding officer responds and encounters small children. And then he needs to call a second car supervisor. So now you have two squads tied up. And children, and then they find out that there's another child on his way home from school. So now you need to bring in additional resources and figure those things out. And instead of, you know, an officer calling another officer calls another officer, and now you have multiple officers on a scene, and perhaps in a culturally sensitive space, the additional officers coming in isn't always the best answer. And so this is where Chief Arredondo's vision was, is that, you know, could we have civilian responders be able to come in and do some of that work that needs to happen afterwards? And that was the vision for the Community Navigator Program, was that we'd have a team of civilians in the department that would be able to go out and support and relieve officers from some of those circumstances.
You've also helped to shape the Minnesota Working Group on Police-Involved Deadly Force Encounters. Can you explain more about what and when this task force was happening?
So the Minnesota Working Group on Police-Involved Deadly Force Encounters was announced in July of 2019. I came on board at the Department of Public Safety in March, and on my first day, I was handed this project, and that was to bring stakeholders together and come up with recommendations to prevent or reduce deadly force encounters in the state. And so given that mission, I started searching out the best of who I had come across in my previous years of experience working in government, and was able to bring in Ron Davis, who worked for President Barack Obama and led the President's 21st Century Policing Task Force. So Ron Davis joined us and helped us establish a framework that would allow for community and all stakeholders really to be able to contribute in this effort to cull recommendations and then present recommendations that all would ultimately prevent or reduce deadly force encounters for officers and community in Minnesota. And we held our first hearing in August, and then there were 4 hearings that continued through January. They also held listening sessions, and these hearings and listening sessions happened around the state of Minnesota. So one of the things that we learned in the working group is that deadly force encounters in the state, 60% of them happen in greater Minnesota. So looking at the data over the previous 5 years, with 60% of them happening in greater Minnesota, this clearly was a statewide issue. So when we went on the road, it was Bemidji, Cloquet, Worthington. We were in St. Paul, Brooklyn Park, Minneapolis. So we really tried to get spread around, and at each of those hearings or listening sessions, the public was invited to come forward and speak, to share recommendations. And then on each of those hearing days, we had testimony from both local and national subject matter experts to bring various perspectives for the working group to consider.
On the website, alongside this visual Q&A, we're going to put a link up to the actual task force recommendations. There's a lot of them, I know, but I'm wondering if you can just list a couple of the things that that you want to lift up that are among those recommendations.
So among the recommendations, there's a good, probably close to a third of them, if not more than closer to half, that have been implemented to date. And so some that I can lift up from that. The governor on July 23rd of this year signed the Minnesota Police Accountability Act, which the legislature passed, and that included a number of changes to include an update to the state's use of deadly force statute, to use of force policy that impacts officers are going to be required to, they're going to have a duty to report, a duty to intervene in misconduct. There's additional less lethal training that's going to be happening as a result of some of the statutory language changes. Previous to this year in the working group, there was really minimal impact, minimal enforcement or regulatory authority that people think the post board has the power to do things that they didn't have power to do. And so in July, with the passage of that Minnesota Police Accountability Act, there's going to be some changes seen to the post board as well.
Now, I know that these recommendations came out in February, as I understand, which was a few months, of course, before George Floyd was killed by police. So obviously recommendations don't stop deadly force from happening. So can you kind of walk through for people also what are these designed to do, especially after something happens?
The recommendations, they're very significant. Some of them are written in a way where it seems like, a conversation needs to take place. Well, putting in writing that a conversation needs to take place is different than someone just saying, yeah, we're going to keep talking about it. We're going to work on it. And the fact that it's now it's in writing in the recommendations, it gives people another layer of accountability. And by people, I think there's two examples of that in the recommendations. One was for the Attorney General's office and the Minnesota County Attorneys Association to continue dialogue or continue talking about what role the Attorney General should have in police-involved death cases. I want to say it was the beginning of June, the County Attorneys Association in Minnesota voted to support having the Office of the Attorney General lead some of that work. That's a significant change that happened from one recommendation that said a conversation needs to take place. Is the recommendation which the legislature funded to establish a separate police-involved investigations unit at the BCA. So the BCA, for people that don't know, the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, is a part of the Department of Public Safety and is responsible for investigating most police-involved deaths in the state of Minnesota. I think there's 2 counties where that's not required. So moving forward, the BCA is going to have this separate investigative unit where the investigators will be cleared from, the appearance of conflict of interest, and that is going towards something that we heard very loudly from community was that they wanted to see. Um, they wanted to see a separate, independent investigative unit.
So you've also said that there is kind of an us versus them narrative about public safety that can have unintended consequences. Can you explain a little bit about what you mean by that?
20 some years of working with police and elected officials and community, you see that, and it keeps people stuck. That's what my observation is that it's us versus them is a place of comfort for some. It's a place of, really not knowing where the next step should be or come from. And that feels better to stay in that kind of a posture versus, maybe coming out forward, stepping forward and conciliatory first step and what it takes sometimes to reset a dialogue. So us versus them, it keeps people stuck. But, as different as the members of the working group were, I want to just throw this out for them too, is that there were some really diverse perspectives on that working group and they stayed at the table. And so it's possible to work through that. It really, I've seen it happen, and it's a incredibly powerful thing to witness. It's a hard thing for the people that are doing the work to sit at the table and keeping the goal in front of them of what they're trying to accomplish. And I saw that over and over with that group.
So yeah, this idea of defunding or abolishing the police is certainly a big topic of conversation. Lots of different perspectives about what that even means, what that accomplishes, what the alternatives are, what the needs are. But what I'd like to primarily have you address is this question, especially since you've had so many years of working in different types of programs in law enforcement. If money were no object, what do you think would benefit public safety the most in terms of, what the police force is there for?
That's a great question. Well, I guess I would start. If there was unlimited funds, we would implement all the recommendations statewide across the board from the working group. And so within that, what's covered in there? What else is covered in there? So that covers training, covers mental health, response shift in the state. We heard from NAMI was presented during the working group, and just the needs of the mental health system, and that it's a very complex issue, but one that ends up in the lap of the police all the time. A hospital that has a psych ward that has trained people that have worked for years and years de-escalating people in crisis. What happens when they call 911 for them, for the officers to show up? Like, what does that mean? And his words were, the only difference between these trained subject matter expert professionals and my 23-year-old police officer is a gun. There's a lot on the table. The working group couldn't tackle everything related to mental health, but they could take the tip of the iceberg. If unlimited funds, we would reimagine, I think, the mental health system and the way that we work with people that are in crisis and in need, and not even, and before they get to that stage. Well, I don't have the data in front of me, but I remember hearing data about the number of cases, the police involved, use of deadly force by police, and the number of those cases where people were under the influence as well. So mental health crisis and being under the influence were factors or criteria that were found in retrospect looking at the incidents that have occurred. And addiction also plays a role, not just in deadly force, but you look domestic violence and child wellness and child welfare. So there's addiction plays a big part in the things that happen in the situations that police are called to respond to as well. Yeah. And again, I don't think this is revelationary either to anyone, but police don't want to go to calls where they don't know, they don't have the tools in the box. Those that I've talked to that have worked with, in co-responder relationships and dynamics, they really appreciate that support and knowledge and having the person with them. So,
one other thing I'm going to just throw in there, because I know there's been conversation more now also about we have a lot of unhoused people right now, and there's different reactions to that and different threats in neighborhoods and different feelings of discomfort or what we can do. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on kind of how that is addressed as a community issue.
Working with the unsheltered population is something that in the metro here, our officers are getting more experience and more exposure to. So I've even seen a shift in the way, just philosophically, that police interact with those that are unsheltered. And that starts going back, I don't know how many years ago, there were some changes in as far as, decriminalizing vagrancy and panhandling and things like that. The police don't want to police the unsheltered. Police want to keep people safe. When there's a need for them to remove someone from a situation and they may have a warrant for some really violent offenses or things like that. That's the kind of activity that I've been aware of personally that happens around some of the encampments. Over time, I've seen a shift in the way that policing is done for those that are unsheltered. But really, deciding what role the police should play in these neighborhoods where the encampments are, that's a tough issue, and I think it requires leadership.
So one other thing I want to bring up in particular about the policing now is, there's these common narratives and a lot of fears that crime is dramatically up right now. I've seen debates on my neighborhood chats and groups and things and Facebook groups about crime and stuff like that. So there's a lot of debates about, crime is not substantially up compared to the 1990s or, but crime is substantially up and there's more killing now, there's more murder now. So there's all kinds of emotions wrapped into this, all kinds of fears. And so it's very difficult to have these conversations when there's different levels of people and how they look at and approach something as scary as especially violent crime. Basically, it's about this idea that police reform is also just, some feel it's just not possible. We have to dismantle everything, start from the bottom. So that's a whole bunch of big, giant concerns. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on speaking to those.
Policing and what's needed right now. That's kind of where I think I'll start. We can look at the numbers, we can look historically and say it's up or down, but also what do we feel right now and what do we know right now? And there are basic services that people come to expect from their police department. And there's been some debate about whether these expectations apply in all cities or not. And one example is when we talk about policing, now I'm going to talk about the structure internally that allows policing to happen. But I'm talking about when you call 911, what's an acceptable response time? And are you okay with priority 2 or 3 calls not getting answered? So if your car gets broken into, if someone drives down the street or walks down the street and knocks out 15 windows or tires, that's a priority 2 or 3 call. Do you want a police officer to come take your report for that? If not, then how do we, what part of the law says that someone else can take the report? Then you can talk about restructuring based off of what you expect in the initial moment. Also, for violent crimes or for domestic violence and things like that, it often requires more than 1 squad, more than 2 officers. And when you talk about the climate that they're in today, there are some neighborhoods and there are some places where officers require 4 cars. We're talking about resources and the response, the obligation that the city has to respond to 911 calls. Everything else, when we're talking about investigations or community engagement or the records unit or getting your property back if you lost your wallet and somebody turns it in, all of those things are secondary work and efforts that happen in the police department. So when the budget is cut and they're talking about what services do you want, you need to start with, what do I want a cop to come to my house for? And how long do I want it to take? And I have been in the police department, going back to 2001. And more often than not, over the last 20 years, I heard that it took the police too long to get there. The other piece is, you know, when it comes to getting justice, so you have been victimized, you have been robbed, your house has been burglarized, and in order for someone to be held accountable, and we're not, you know, I'm using like higher level crimes as an example here because these are the things that most people aren't going to have a disagreement about needing a police officer to respond. So for those kinds of calls, there's an investigation that happens, and there has to be investigators in the police department to do that role as well. And so that's another discussion I think that's going to be coming up on the horizon, particularly in the urban core here in Minneapolis. A lot of people just don't know how much the police department impacts their ability to feel whole when something bad happens. It's not just about the needed reforms, but there's also a very important part of life that happens when you need to call 911 for a situation and you need that situation to be resolved and you want justice. And then the other things that people don't see, which is the community engagement work, the time that officers might give back volunteering or working with young people.
Yeah, and you're right. There's that piece you were talking about. It's just the emotional idea that somebody's there, even if they're not immediately at your door to protect you. The peace of mind that can come from feeling confident that they are out there. You know, that certainly I saw that a lot in the reactions during the uprising. Is where are they feeling panic because the fear was that there was just nobody around to protect. You know, I know one of the things you had mentioned to me when we talked was that, you know, there are some great success programs. I think you mentioned something in St. Cloud. Kind of what would you like to lift up as examples of things that are happening in Minnesota that you think people should know about?
There's 10,000 police, I think, in the state of Minnesota. There's a lot of police departments here, and there some of them are doing some innovative and really grounded in community things. And one of those cities is St. Cloud. St. Cloud has two things that I actually want to lift up. One, they have a community policing agreement in place in their community, and they brought a lot of stakeholders together and over a period of time developed this document. That's possible. I just want to say that. And then the other thing that St. Cloud has done is they have what's called a cop house. So they purchased a house on one of the blocks that had more livability issues in the city and renovated it and have created youth programming out of that, tutoring and mentoring and some other things. And I think they also rent out some of the rooms in the house. You know, it's really grounded and rooted in community. The community selected a lot of the things that go into the program, and they played a role in it and built it and developed it together with the police department.
You have a quote by Nelson Mandela above your desk that says, it always seems impossible until it is done. So can you close out our conversation by talking about what might seem impossible today, but that you think really can get done, and how it is that we get there?
I would say common ground. And there are times and moments where it feels like we will never find it, that it's going to be impossible to get there. And then I remember the working group, and I remember one of their toughest days, and they stayed at the table. They got up, they walked out, they took a walk, came back, but they stayed at the table. And what we have out of it is this document that really is going to shift the dial in a big way here in the state of Minnesota as it comes to preventing and reducing deadly force. And so whether it's police reform, whether it's reimagining a police department, it is possible for people to come to the table and stay together.